Hello. I'm Jude Kelly. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ripples of Hope Festival. And, oh, thank you. Thank you. And you might be coming just for this evening. Obviously, our hope is that you'll love this evening so much that you then come for the whole of the weekend and don't give any time to the rest of your personal life. You just completely immerse yourself in the deep and wonderful job of working out how you can take the theory of human rights and the imaginative possibility of those human rights being genuinely for everyone, and then work out how you make that absolutely rooted and systemic within the societies that we belong to and that we're helping to shape for the future. The festival was conceived as a way of trying to say to all of us, you know, this thing of how do you make practical human rights? How do you make them a reality? How do you live them out in your daily life? How do you live them out within your own communities? And also, how do you notice how somebody else doesn't have the rights that you have? How do you understand your own privilege, and how do you use your privilege to make change? And there's something which would say that all of us sitting here, the fact that we can sit here tonight makes us know already that we have enormous privilege, and therefore we have enormous potential for agency and change making. The whole of the Ripples of Hope initiative comes from Robert F. Kennedy, Human Rights. And I'm going to read you the quote behind the phrase Ripples of Hope, because it's very inspiring, and of course it is Bobby Kennedy's quote. Every time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And you know how it can be, and especially has been very traumatic during COVID, when you think, well, what can I actually do? You know, all the food banks, all the loneliness, the homelessness returning. I mean, there's so many things, not to mention what's happening on the global stage, Afghanistan, Hong Kong. It makes you sometimes feel so inadequate and so powerless. But if you can take this idea that a ripple of hope can spread and spread and spread, then you can think, well, it's not just about me. It's about small actions that can make change. And in a way, that is what this offering of a festival is as well. It's a ripple of hope. The festival's made up of many, many speakers and many, many contributors, Manchester-based, Greater Manchester-based, coming from the rest of the UK, coming from the rest of the globe, albeit virtually from the rest of the globe. But it speaks to the idea that all our voices are needed. And speaking of the idea of voices, one of the things that we've tried to do during the festival is not just this big weekend of conversations, which we hope you'll be part of, or the Speak Truth to Power Day tomorrow, which is specifically for schools. But we've done 14 community feasts, or there are 14 community feasts that will be happening during this period of time, where different communities come together, break bread sort of literally, and share ideas over food, over drink, and cross barriers, change prejudices, share ideas. We've also asked Simon Armitage, the poet laureate, and of course the great Northern voice, to bring together poets from around the world to write to each of the human rights. There are 30 human rights that were created during post-war reforming of kind of human hope. And those 30 rights have been written about by 30 different poets, and you'll see them on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday night, all performing. And then we have the poetic royalty of the land, not just Simon Armitage himself, but Linton Kwesi Johnson, Jackie Kay and Carol Ann Duffy also all coming to perform. So it's a very rich festival. We're very excited about it. And of course, it had to be in Manchester. That just goes without saying. It had to be in Manchester, because Manchester and Greater Manchester have that history of fighting for human rights, and also a history of truthfulness. I mean, I'm not saying Manchester is without any fault at all. As a Liverpudlian, that would be obscene for me even to mention that. But what I am saying is that it is great that Manchester is so doughty and so determined always to make space to confront things that need to be spoken about. And so it's wonderful to have the very first festival that we've done in Manchester. And we'd like to thank Manchester City Council and Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Arts Council, and of course, Home, for giving us a home here. And thank you to Home. So speaking of Manchester, Before I introduce Baroness Helena Kennedy, who's going to be in conversation with Hillary Clinton tonight, I'd like to introduce one of your homegrown talents, Keisha Thompson, poet, activist, producer, performer, and also herself a senior director at the Arts Council working for children and young people, who's going to come and talk to us about one of these 30 poems that are referred to. So if I could introduce Keisha Thompson. Have a seat. So, Keisha, one of the challenges we've got tonight is that Sam, who's one of our BSL translators, is going to be translating for you. And later you'll meet Rob, by the way, who's going to be translating for Hillary. A real honour. Rob, have you ever done any translating for a notorious and reputable person like Hillary Clinton? Her husband? Her husband, oh. In what circumstances? Anyway, we'll come to that later. But let's just get straight down to the poem that you created. I mean, when Simon approached you and said, look, choose any of these 30 human rights and see what you respond to, tell us about what your first reaction was.
It was very flattering, first of all, to just be approached by Simon. I was like, oh, does he know who I am? Yeah, that one spoke to me, Article 25, which is to have access to food, shelter, healthcare, and there's a fourth one, work, to be able to work. It just seemed like the bottom part of the Maslow's triangle, like very, very basic
needs.
Yeah, and that's why it spoke to me, because I know that if those things are not in place, if you don't have that foundation, you can't do anything else. So I think that's why it spoke to me, because it felt so ground level and so accessible that it felt like it needed to be acknowledged.
And during this COVID period, when you've been looking at your own communities and looking at those basic needs,
yes.
What's been your feeling about how much we together are able to give people that sense of respect, that they're entitled to those things and that they can have them without having to, unconditionally they're available?
Yeah, I think it's made me appreciate my locality way more. I think it was really easy and in some ways necessary for the media to go down a route of negativity and show us footage of people scrambling in supermarkets and there not being enough toilet paper. But I actually went into my local shops and the food bank baskets were full and there was toilet paper and people were going for walks and smiling at each other, and there was just a lot of care in my area. So it really made me appreciate where I am, which is in Whalley Range, South Manchester, and it's a very multicultural area, and I think it was a testament to that, of the fact that we'd already been practicing what it means to live amongst each other, and when times get really tricky, to continue with that. So that's what my head went to. And I was just listening to really interesting interviews on the radio, and there was someone who was saying that the media should do a good job of showing hypervigilance, of showing people who are going out of their way to follow the rules and consider other people, as opposed to constantly feeding us these stories of people who are breaking the rules, because it felt like that's what was happening quite a lot, and it makes you not want to follow the rules, if that's what you hear.
Yeah, so in other words, we should be majoring on how much care and attention people in society are capable of giving to each other, rather than just look at the outlandish ones. And I mean, just one final question about poetry, really. I mean, Shelley said that poets are the unofficial legislators of the world. So always believed that poetry had a way of kind of cutting to the moral core.
Yeah.
And I think so much of now the kind of poetry that particularly in this generation has created speaks very, very strongly about moral purpose.
Yes.
and calling things out. What drew you to become a writer? Was it that kind of morality, or did the morality did you need to find a space for the morality to be expressed?
I think so. Like, I was attracted to literature and writing from a really young age. Both my parents are avid readers, so I've literally been brought up around books and bookshelves. But yeah, I was encouraged to write from a very young age, and then I got validated when I was 10 because I got published in an anthology. And from then I was like, oh, I'm a writer. And then from that point, I really started to interrogate what that means, and listening to artists like Nina Simone, who say, you know, document your times, and Maria Baraka, who's now passed away and was a poet laureate in America. He was very much about take the politics to the street, like this is a sacred space, learning about the role of griot, which is like the lineage of like African oratory, poetry, and how you speak to the people and you speak about the times. I started to realise that whenever I get given a platform as a writer, that I really have to take that quite seriously, and it's quite a sacred space, and it's quite a gift to be able to translate the zeitgeist into something that feels accessible and pretty as well. It needs to sound nice. It should rhyme sometimes, maybe.
Well, look, I've had the pleasure of hearing this poem a few times now, about sort of stemmed from watching your mother make meringue. I think it's a wonderful poem. Perhaps you'd like to read it now for us. So, thank you.
Cool. Thank you. How to make an Article 25. Ingredients. It starts with a bold notion that it should be written down. Equipment. I often think about the person who invented meringue, their aching arm, legislating a dream for something different from this translucent, slimy substance before them. A whisk, gavelling hope into soft white peaks, a sweetness in the air. Prep. My mother never writes anything down. She prefers for me to watch her in the act, follow and repeat until it gets into my bones, but I secretly take notes. Worry about being alone or failing to pass this on. Method. How many times do you lick your fingers before reaching for pen and paper? Confident you've come up with something good enough for everyone. A precedent of good taste. A full-bellied declaration for your future guests and your unborn children. An invitation to a never-ending banquet. Clear and concise. A petition of ingredients that you hope everyone can get hold of. A half-stained writ composed on the side of an apron. Something good has happened here. Knowing you will not be in this kitchen forever, you hope that this meal will outlive you. Alternative suggestions. Please rewrite this recipe in languages I cannot speak, with ingredients I do not know. Spill oil and water and red wine and laughter all over it. Convert grams to cups and double up the quantities and do whatever you need to do to make it make sense to you. Until you don't have to look at it anymore. Until the measurements are in your bones and you can make a dance of this recipe on a Sunday afternoon. Please put it through the letterbox of your neighbour or make it a visible bookmark in the novel that you donate to your local charity shop. Don't assume that someone will just find it or that somebody's probably come up with something better somewhere else. This recipe was not written with self-doubt or serendipity in mind. Thank you.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce a great woman who's then going to introduce another great woman. I'm really thrilled that despite all the difficulties that we've had of travel, that Baroness Helena Kennedy has joined us today and will be here on Friday morning as well. She's one of the great criminal rights lawyers. That's what she's been doing all her life. And she's carried on founding and inventing and restating her values over and over again in all kinds of practical ways. She's written 2 fantastic books about how the justice system doesn't serve women. She's the founder of the Bonnevero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford, and she's currently the director to the International Bar Association of the Human Rights Institute. So here she is, Baroness Helena Kennedy.
Hello. Okay. I'll leave you. See you. I'm in Rodham. Well, hello to Manchester and all of you, and hello to Secretary Clinton there. It's lovely to see you. I'm going to unmute. Let me just do this. You know, we've all learned that unmuting is the essential thing to do. Hello, Secretary Clinton.
Hello.
Hi, nice to see you. Wonderful to see you and to have you here with us. I'm sitting in front of a wonderful audience here in Manchester, and they're all getting ready to help change the world, and you're going to be the inspiration for that. I'm now sitting in a little part of the stage which has been made to look as though it could be somebody's sitting room, mine, and that I'm entertaining you, albeit that you're across the Atlantic, and I see that you're sitting comfortably as well. It's really wonderful to see you, and I want to just mention something about the warmth with which this great city received a message that you sent when this city suffered the horror of the arena bombing. And you sent a message of comfort and compassion, and it really was taken to the hearts of the people of Manchester. And so I want on their behalf to thank you for that. You really were one of the first to make your sharing of their pain felt. Now, I wanted to just really start by saying to you, we're living in a very difficult time. We were just seeing the horrors of what has been happening in Afghanistan. And of course, it has its beginnings back in 9/11, which you've been speaking out about in this last week. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you feel about that cycle coming to this rather unhappy conclusion?
Well, let me begin by expressing my gratitude for being part of this important conference. And I just had the chance to speak with Mayor Andy Burnham and to really express my appreciation and admiration for the way that the city came together after the arena bombing, and local leaders from across the city have provided very inspiring and practical, realistic leadership. And of course, the mayor told me that Manchester is now considered the 3rd most attractive city in the world, which doesn't surprise me at all.
And it is.
And yes, I think you only have 2 ahead of you, San Francisco and Amsterdam, and I could never speak against, a city in my own country, but the way should be clear to keep moving forward. Thank you all for gathering under the aegis of the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Foundation. It's just an incredibly important work. You ask about Afghanistan, and I have to start by saying that the terrible attack that we suffered on 9/11 in 2001 brought together a great partnership among many nations that supported the United States in our effort to try to bring to justice those who had attacked us and to try to prevent further attacks from emanating from Afghanistan. 20 years on, I know there's a great and very worthy debate about what really was accomplished and where do we go from here. And there will be a lot of ink spilled and words used to define what people believe about that. But I would make just a couple of very brief points. One, the military action undertaken by the United States and our allies did make it possible for us to eventually bring Osama bin Laden to justice, which I personally was involved in when I was Secretary of State working with President Obama. It also prevented further attacks against the United States, Europe, other places in the world, using Afghanistan as a staging area and platform. But it also provided for millions of Afghans, women and men, girls and boys, a chance to look and move toward a different future. I do believe that that was an important outcome of these past 20 years. The number of girls and women who were participating in education, in government and politics and journalism and business across the board and in every aspect of society within the major cities of Afghanistan lit a fire inside so many that they wanted to be part of building a different future in their country. Unfortunately, the collapse of the Afghan military and government, which sadly was, I think, foreordained once the prior American administration signed an agreement with the Taliban that asked nothing from them. No commitment to human rights, no commitment even to preventing terrorist attacks or joining forces again with al-Qaeda. And once that agreement was signed by the Trump administration, there was no turning back. And whether it took 11 days or 11 weeks, it would have been very difficult under the circumstances where the Afghan government was not a party to the agreement, had not been included in those peace talks, so-called, to sustain a government and a military. So the collapse was rapid and devastating. And very tragically, the Taliban appears to have picked up where they left off, being an oppressive agent within their society, rolling back hard-fought gains for women, seeking out punishment and revenge. I hope that it will become more stable. I hope that some of what they said rhetorically, like keeping schools open for girls, letting women go to work, will prove to be true, but I'm quite pessimistic about that. So where does that leave us? I think, number one, we have a continuing human responsibility, speaking of human rights, to those who are refugees, who will be fleeing Afghanistan, not just those who fled by airplane over the last weeks, but those traveling by foot into Pakistan, Iran, other places. And we have just joined forces, my husband and I, with former President and Mrs. Bush and former President and Mrs. Obama to run a program to welcome Afghan refugees to the United States, and I hope others will join us. We will also have to do what we can from a distance now to try to prevent a resumption of terrorist planning. And we will have to keep a close look at what happens inside Pakistan, because I believe that the forces of extremism inside Pakistan will be quite heartened by what's happened across their border and may well pose problems for the stability of Pakistan going forward, and there will be other spillover effects. But let me end by saying this. There has been a lot of discussion in our press, and in general, the American people strongly supported President Biden's decision to, accept what I would argue was the inevitable outcome, the fact that President Trump had said we would be out by May 1st. President Biden wisely said we can't be organized by then. It's very difficult to do this. We will be out by September, which indeed we were. And people have said, well, we didn't accomplish anything. And I respectfully disagree with that. It was a terrible loss of life on all sides, not only American military personnel and civilians, but people from your country and so many other countries, as well as tens of thousands of Afghans caught in a continuing war that has gone on now for way too long. So I hope we will not forget the people of Afghanistan, both those who have left their country and those who are still there, as we think about human rights and what we can do, hopefully, to protect theirs.
Hilary, this audience is full of women who I know are particularly concerned about the women. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been working quite intensively on trying to get women judges, women prosecutors who were prosecuting many of the Taliban men who were still in rural villages beating women and so on. And we're trying to get out the people who sort of set up some of the institutions that brought women into the law. And we're trying to consider ways of getting that done. And I just would like for them, because they're very keen to hear from you about, is a special commitment being given to those who are really high risk? Because the stories I remember you were working on this, and certainly I was, back in the late 90s, when women were taken into a stadium and actually stoned to death or beheaded. And so it's a fearful possibility for many of those women who actually already have a target on their backs. What are our nations doing about those particular women? Are we making special emergency visas available for them? The women journalists? The women police officers?
It is, as I'm sure you know, and I would like your audience to know, been a very difficult 2 months for those of us who have been focused on trying to help women and their families who are at risk, who are under danger, some of whom have previously escaped assassination attempts by the Taliban and their sympathizers, to try to marshal the resources and support to get as many of them out of the country as possible. And as you rightly point out, judges, police officers, women in government and politics of the Afghan government, women in medicine and education, just women journalists across the board. So many thousands of women have been really put at risk because of the return of the Taliban. I think there are several things. Number one, we have to keep raising this issue. Most governments were rightly focused on evacuating their own citizens and evacuating those who had worked directly for either their military or civilian presence. That was their responsibility. I totally accept that. Many of us on the outside of government, through charities and non-governmental organizations, activist groups and the like, worked very hard to raise the money for charter flights, to find ways to get women to the airport, to get them on planes, either government planes that were leaving that could take them, or charter flights that had been paid for outside of government money. And we were able to move quite a number, but nowhere near what the need is turning out to be, because clearly the Taliban is reneging on any rhetorical claim they made that they would respect the rights of women to continue their lives. So we are faced with a very difficult circumstance. People who hold passports from other countries or have some kind of legal residency in other countries. There should be a concerted effort between both governments and non-governmental advocates to try to get them out on the commercial flights as the airport is reopening. But the vast majority of the women we're concerned about do not have any other nationality. They may have, many of them do, Afghan passports, but they're going to need visas. And that's where your comment really comes in. Some countries have been quite generous, and here I want to just mention one. There are others, but Albania has been quite remarkable in its willingness, a small country that had suffered from totalitarian rule for many years, predominantly Muslim, but Christian minority country that is working hard to try to provide refuge for people who do get out, and they've paid particular attention to women who have been evacuated. But we need visas. We need visas from countries that are willing to receive them while these women go through the process to apply for some kind of status within your country, my country, and others. So we have to keep the pressure on. We have to keep the stories before the public and before government officials. I know that there has been a recent crackdown by the Taliban on charters that thought they would already be literally lifting up and getting out of the country over the last 2 weeks.
I've just been doing this. We've had a flight that we were trying to get out on Sunday night, and we still haven't got it out, and we're here now in Thursday.
Well, but I think part of what we need is to get not only our governments, the UK and the US government, but governments that have some kind of continuing connection with the Taliban government. And, you know, some countries have said, you know, we want to do business in Afghanistan. And we need our governments to help us convince those other countries to let these people who are at risk leave the country. So this work continues. It is very dangerous and difficult work for those who are in the country trying to help arrange it. And it's very frustrating and maddening and nerve-wracking and heartbreaking work for people like us who are outside trying to support those who are working to help get as many women to safety as possible.
Now, there are other things that are really on the minds of our audience, and many of them are concerned about the divisions that seem to be in your society as well as ours, but divisions that seem to be really cutting across the whole world. Divisions that perhaps... Oh, is someone unwell? Oh. Could someone help? There's someone in the audience has become unwell. Okay, thank you. We're going to continue, Secretary Clinton. Someone has taken very unwell at the front of the audience, and people are moving in to take care of the person. Is there anyone who's medically qualified who can come and help, please? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. We see so many divisions in our societies, and the rise of populist governments around the world, and it seems to be one of the sort of blights of our time. And I just wondered what you were feeling about that. I remember that hearing you, and I think I was in conversation with you then, where we were talking about this idea that somehow liberal democracy was being abandoned. And I just wondered, I mean, that's one of the great things that's dividing societies, that this rise of populism, short messages, promising people easy solutions to very difficult problems. What is the answer to that?
Well, I certainly agree that liberal democracy is under attack, and it's under attack by those who wish to impose minority views, often authoritarian leadership models on the larger society. and again, speaking for the United States, we are in the midst of quite a struggle over whether we will have a majority government, in the sense that voters who vote in the majority for the candidates or the causes that they care about will be able to withstand the very determined opposition from well-funded, often ideologically quite right-wing nationalist authoritarian movements to try to undermine that. So, for example, we just had a, quote, recall election against the governor of California. Thankfully, he won, but the reason it was even undertaken is because he followed science when it came to the pandemic. He had, in the early days, to make the tough decisions about lockdowns and quarantines, and then he was very adamant about the need to get vaccinated. So well-organized, well-funded opposition groups associated with the Republican Party were able to get a recall election put up, and the vote was yesterday. Now, he won in part because the majority was very clear, look, we want to end this pandemic, and part of the way we end this pandemic is by having vaccines and having them mandated for certain activities. But we also see in two of our very largest states with Republican governors, Texas and Florida, a concerted effort to undermine voting because they didn't like the outcome in 2020. And the big lie that there was something wrong with our election is being promoted in order to change election laws so that minority candidates, by that I mean people who don't necessarily win the most votes, and we already have this bizarre institution called the Electoral College, which I know all too well, having won more votes but lost to the Electoral College. But this is what they want to impose on our country in an even more drastic, draconian way. So I think people who care about the value of voting, which was pioneered in your country and then followed up by ours, I mean, people who care about having the rule of law, people who understand that we're better off if we're an inclusive rather than exclusive society, all of these pillars of liberal democracy, I think have to pay attention because it is certainly under attack in our country and in other places as well.
I mean, we're sort of always sort of two steps behind the United States, but we tend to pick up on so many of the things that happen in your part of the world. And we're having similar attempts made to change electoral policy and introduce the requirement of identity to be shown and proved and so on. But one of the things that people are concerned about here is that there really is a big gap between those who are comfortably off. I mean, the very well off do fine, in fact, have done even better during COVID. And many have become enriched during the COVID period. And yet many have suffered greatly, not just losing their loved ones, but also the hardship that's come with losing businesses and jobs and really having a hard time. But that was operating beforehand with all the austerity policies we had. I mean, those divisions are very real, and they've, to some extent, played out in your country as well. And I just wanted to know what your view was on how you step forward and how you talk about a fairer, more redistributed, a more equal sort of society and the role that government has in creating that.
Well, you're seeing that with the policies that are being proposed by President Biden, which, number one, aimed at trying to cushion the losses that you rightly described happened because of the pandemic. The huge loss of jobs, loss of income, efforts were made to prevent evictions because people couldn't pay their rent. There were so many steps taken, thankfully, that the impact of the pandemic, although severe and disproportionately, we learned on women who had to leave the workforce because schools were closed and childcare was closed, and they had no alternatives. This has been a perfect example of what government can and should do to try to cushion, as we used to say, the hazards and vicissitudes of life that come to all of us at some point. But what President Biden is also trying to do is make a very big investment program in infrastructure, putting many, many people across our country to work, doing really important kinds of rebuilding, and also to try to strengthen the social safety net in America, where we don't have paid family leave, we don't have affordable quality childcare, we don't have, despite the best efforts of so many of us, guaranteed quality affordable health care for everyone. So we have a lot of work to be done, and the divide between our parties on a partisan basis is so stark. And we're going to have a very big legislative struggle over the next 2 months to see whether President Biden can get the votes he needs to expand the social safety net, to invest in jobs and research, and make a very big investment in dealing with climate change by investing in renewable energy and by trying to provide alternative jobs for those who will be made redundant because of changes in the way we're going to be funding and using energy. So you're right that the divide is so great and it is so unfair, and an unequal society with so few haves and so many have-nots is an unstable society, one that is sadly more prone to authoritarian demagogues who make promises that they have no intention of keeping, who play on people's fears rather than their hopes, who practice disunity rather than unity. So we have our work cut out for us, and I think that's exactly the agenda that President Biden and the Democrats are really trying to implement. And if we do, it will be a generational change, which is so long overdue, and will begin to deal with some of these deep structural inequalities.
Well, we certainly could do with it here too, I can tell you. Now, there have been two big movements have taken place in recent times. The Me Too movement, which actually did have, if you were talking about ripples that extend beyond, the ripples that extended from the Me Too movement went around the world with women saying they too had experienced those things, even if they hadn't been raped or actually sexually assaulted. They had had the undermining, the harassments, the daily round of being held in secondary places, of being in some way feeling unentitled when they're in the company of men who feel entitled. A real feeling that somehow this had to stop. And yet, are we making progress? And many of the women in this audience, and men who sympathize and want to change the world too, want it to be renegotiated. We'd ask you, how do we go about it? How do we do it?
Well,
there's laughter in the audience.
Because many of us have lived through quite significant changes when it comes to the rights and roles and opportunities for women to be full participants in society, yet we know how far we still have to go, and that the double standard is alive and well in every aspect of society. So the work must continue, but I do think there's a much greater awareness. There is also an acceptance that things have to change. It just is not good enough to, have lip service, so to speak, to trying to provide more equality if you're going to continue to undermine women in the workplace, women in the political arena, or the courtroom, or media, or wherever else women seek to fulfill their own dreams and aspirations. So I think that a lot of the high visibility given to the whole range of implicit bias to actual assault that women, not just in our countries, but around the world, are subjected to on a daily basis, has led to at least greater awareness, but that awareness has to be translated into action. And I'll just end with a quick little story because it's an encouraging one. So there's a huge corporation, a tech corporation called Salesforce, which maybe many of your audience know of. And a few years ago, the CEO, Mark Benioff, was hearing all the time that there was implicit bias and women didn't progress. And he thought to himself, I don't think that applies to my company. We've tried to be very open and very supportive. But to test his own theory, he conducted a very thorough examination. And here's what he found, basically, that when both young men and young women are hired into the company, they start basically on the same level of education, experience, pay, and benefits. But something happens very quickly, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all of a sudden, those career paths begin to diverge. And as he rightly said, I couldn't understand it. And then I realized that it wasn't, in some cases, even intentional. It was just the way things had always been done and how people always thought. And so therefore, it took some real effort, which is ongoing, to try to open up those implicit biases. The story that we've all experienced, you're in a meeting, a woman speaks up, nobody pays any attention, she puts her idea out there, people blow past it. A few minutes later, a man says the same thing, people pay attention. It's not like it was orchestrated. It is just almost in the DNA. It goes back so many thousands and thousands of years of human history. So unless you are consciously aware of the biases you bring to judging employees, judging colleagues, judging ideas, and you are honest enough to say, wait a minute, if that idea had been presented first by a woman who I listened to, would I have heard it? And would I have said, oh, that's a good idea? What made me not hear it? And so I think that the work is, still
getting people
ahead
to
of us.
listen. And of course, that's true on women making complaints to the police, to authorities, to employers about
Right.
what they experience. I'm going to turn to the issue of race because we all learned from the terrible event of the murder of George Floyd and then the repercussions of that around the world again. And certainly here in the United Kingdom, huge interest in what had happened and concern because it resonated with many of the experiences here too. And again, expunging racism from our societies, making equal opportunities and real genuine equality for people of colour, for minorities, it's a big challenge, and it's big in your society and in ours. Are we making headway?
Well, I think we are making, again, some headway, but still not near enough. And this, again, comes down to changing institutions, how institutions operate, recognizing systemic racism is kind of built into institutions in our countries, and individuals, how we think about race, what our own biases might be. What George Floyd did and the Black Lives Matter movement really, I think, opened a lot of people's eyes to was that despite training about racial bias, despite so much publicity about the unfair, unequal treatment by the police of people of color, particularly men of color and those not, there were still all of these actions that we saw. It used to be that we didn't carry around cameras that we would then point at someone with his knee on the neck of a man face down on the street, unable to breathe. We didn't see it. Now we see it. There should be no more excuses, no more rationales that you don't know about it. Yes, we have seen it. And George Floyd was, yes, in an American city being murdered before our eyes. But there are so many people in situations across the world whose human rights, whose personal autonomy and dignity is being undermined and attacked every day. So yes, we need better laws, we need better understanding, and we need to stand up to those who don't want to learn those lessons. And I will just say, to that point, trying to bring up the actual historic presence of institutional systemic racism from our very beginning in our country has caused some to want to eliminate children learning the history of what actually happened in the United States. They don't want to solve the problem. They want to avoid having to confront it and recognize it is still with us. So yes, we've made changes. We've looked hard at people in power. We've tried to, we've had a trial and convicted the first police officer who was the principal murderer of George Floyd. But we can't act like we've solved this problem, because we have not. And we need to be honest about it and continue to raise changes that are necessary to move as far beyond that as we can.
Hilary, we had a number of questions that came from the audience, but we're running out of time, and I'm going to take them quickly, and so I'm going to have to ask you to deal with them quickly. But Pablo asked, what can he do as a man to push forward the feminist agenda? He says, particularly with my family and friends. How do you do that as a guy? And we want them to do it, So what do we say to him? Pablo is out there. He wants to hear from you.
Well, first, Pablo, thank you.
Thank you, Pablo.
Look, I think being someone who treats women with respect and doesn't stand for disrespect among your peers, your colleagues, others you come into contact with, is a really important step. I mean, look, people make disdainful, hurtful comments. You should be the person who says, look, hey, come on, we're not doing that anymore. You should be the person in a gathering or a meeting who, when a woman speaks up, says, wait a minute, I want to hear. I want to hear what she has to say. Who goes to women maybe you work with or in your own family and ask them what you can do to be a good ally in solidarity with your view that more needs to be done. Vote for people who are respectful of women and their aspirations and their role in society. Do what you can to model the kind of behavior that you would like to see more of. And, in a family, the dynamics are often very difficult, but I think being willing to say, come on, I think we need to do more to make sure that women and men are treated equally, because what does feminism mean? It's a simple belief that women deserve the same rights and treatment in society at every level that men do. And you want to be the person who keeps raising that as an important goal.
Now, Ruth asked a question, and you've really, to some extent, been dealing with it earlier on. It's about the rise of the populist right. And she was saying, what can progressive people do about it? Is there a one-line suggestion on what she could be doing about the rise of this particular form? It's not the traditional old, in the United States, Rockefeller republicanism or one-nation conservatism here. We're getting something of a slightly different order. What would you suggest we do to deal with those sort of more far-out positions? What's the answer? Very briefly.
Well, look, very briefly. Number one, you have to organize and fight against this at the electoral, governmental level every chance you get, from local elections to national elections. Do not get discouraged. This is a long struggle that we are engaged in to try to prevent the rolling back of so many advances in human rights. That's really what it comes down to. We've talked about feminism and women's rights. We've talked about racism and the rights of, Black and brown people. There are lots of organized interests who want to do away with that, to put it back the way it used to be. So do everything you can to elect different kinds of leaders. Secondly, fight online disinformation. You know, that we haven't mentioned the tech companies, but they played a major role in poisoning the electorate, literally poisoning it by permitting outrageous, absolutely false attacks and information. And one of our problems with trying to get people to get vaccinated in the United States is because they read on Facebook that, you know, something terrible will happen to them. They'd rather hear somebody who is selling, you know, herbs and supplements.
Well, we've had a woman saying that, a rapper woman suggesting that it makes men impotent if they get themselves vaccinated. So I just want to tell you chaps out there, you're safe. There's no impotency at risk here. I've got one. Don't worry about that. one last thing, which is Jay says, you know, and there's this business of intersectionality, of the experience of women, but also minority women and women with disability and issues around discrimination on sexuality, all those things that can blight people's lives. And she says, you've faced all sorts of things, you know, and you've dealt with misogyny. And she says, but you've persisted. And she wants to know, what advice would you give about how to keep on keeping on?
Well, first of all, it just so annoys my adversaries that is such a motivation. You know, every time they tell me to go away, disappear, whatever they say, it just gives me a big burst of energy.
We've noticed.
I think it's also important to know what you're fighting for. I think if I were only fighting for my own interests, my own goals, whatever, it would be harder. But I really feel like I am fighting to advance an agenda that I believe in deeply and to help people who are not as fortunate to have a voice or to have a public setting like I do. So make sure you know what you're fighting for and feel that you are, you know, engaged in really important work. And this whole conference and what Manchester is hosting on behalf of human rights, be part of a solidarity movement where you get reinforced and have colleagues and friends with whom you feel you can work together and be in solidarity. I'm lucky because I have had great friends, my family and others who have supported me through the good times and the bad. And I've always believed that I was fighting for what is right. And I wasn't going to be discouraged. I wasn't going to be pushed back or shut down. And so I keep going. And I think that's the great lesson. You know, everybody gets knocked down in life. The real issue is will you get back up and keep going to try to get something better for you and for those that you care about.
And all power to you. Would you join me in thanking Secretary Clinton? Well, I hope you can hear just the uproar that there is here in Manchester. And I now would like to welcome in Paul Lindley, who's the chair of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Foundation here in the UK, and Kerry Kennedy herself, who is over here from the United States of America, who runs the foundation globally and all its great work. So here's Paul Lindley, and here is Kerry herself. And it's great to see you. And I know that you want to have an opportunity of saying something to, how do we make it so that you can say something to...
Is she there?
Yes, she's here.
Just walk
come
around.
on, slide in behind me. Come in and sneak down beside me. There they are.
So good to see you.
Yes. Here's Kerry and Paul, who's a really great supporter and a great champion of human rights, a person in business who's really come in behind all of this. And it's wonderful.
Oh, I just have to thank all of you. Helena, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your lifetime of work in human rights. Paul, this is fabulous that the foundation has this anchor in the UK. May it keep going and just get stronger and stronger. And my dear friend, Kerry, I love you, I admire you, and I thank you for continuing this great work, not only now in the United States, where you've been so active, but in the UK and the world. Thank you so much, Kerry.
I hear that. Thank you, Hillary.
Have you any question for this great woman?
No, I just want to say again, you know, when I think about what you were talking about tonight between the Afghani women and racial justice, social justice in the United States, economic equity, the thing all of these have in common is treating one another with dignity. And I think that that's what you've done your whole life. That's what you've modeled for all of us. That's what you've shown us that we can do, maybe not all in grand ways, not all changing history, but in little ways, in the way we treat one another. And so I just want to thank you, really thank you from the bottom of my heart for being there, for your leadership, and for keeping it going for all of us. Thank you.
You're the president that should have been. Paul.
And Secretary Clinton, I wanted to say a massive thank you on behalf of just 200 or 300 of the people of Manchester here. It's no accident that we are in Manchester. Manchester, as you will know, has been for centuries right at the heart of defending human rights, of championing people power, from the trade union movement being born here, to the cooperative movement being born here, to the workers a century or so ago rejecting first boycott of the cotton that came from the Deep South and the slave plantations, right through to, as we were talking in the last generation, 2 terror attacks that have devastated this city but have brought the resolve of the people of this city in defiance with love and compassion and a determination that human rights will continue in this city. So, like them, your work, like Bobby Kennedy's work, is built on moral imagination and a defense of courage, inspiration, dignity and compassion. So thank you very much.
Right. Well, I think that we might even have a moment for asking you one last thing. I mean, you went through the whole business of that election, and it broke many of our hearts that it turned out the way that it did, and we've had a very painful 4 years of the person who claimed the title. And so I just want to note, are you hopeful? We're here talking about ripples of hope, and this woman is my great friend too. And that inspiration from Robert Kennedy of saying, you know, when those ripples of hope connect and all of the bits that we contribute to it, each of us putting some kind of contribution in there, some action, and it comes together, it can make the change. Where do you see hope at the moment?
Oh, I see so much hope. And it's not just in politics. We did, after all, oust the former president, and that was all for the good of our country and the world. And as I said, we just prevented a ridiculous recall of the governor of California. I do see hope. When people organize, when they are determined, when they stand for something bigger than themselves, there is no stopping us. We just cannot be discouraged. We cannot be out-organized. We cannot be undermined by those forces who want to turn the clock back. And I would just end by saying, I remember reading about Senator Kennedy's speech, because the Ripple of Hope speech was delivered in South Africa.
It was, yes.
And long before Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. And yet, you could talk about ripples of hope even in an apartheid society where the majority black population was oppressed and suppressed. And then finally, after all those ripples built into a tidal wave, there was a sea change. You can't get discouraged when you're trying to make change on behalf of human dignity, on behalf of human rights, on behalf of freedom and opportunity and equality. You cannot get discouraged. And that's one of the great lessons that I hope that people take from this conference, and certainly from Robert Kennedy's words. So I'm always optimistic. I'm realistic that the work is hard, it's slow, it doesn't always go in a straight line, but I'm optimistic that in the end, human dignity wins if we are organized and focused and do everything we can to make that day come.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Well, we're going to let you go now, and thank you for giving us your time, and it was
Thank
really
you all.
great.
I hope to come to Manchester sometime soon. Thank you.
There she goes.
She was great, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And Helena, so were you. I mean, it was just a great feeling. And then when you two... And then when you two were all kneeling round this room, it was a bit like trying to talk to your nana at Christmas, wasn't it? But I mean, I think that's good. You know, I think it's great that it was both very, very thorough in kind of her amazing experience and
Life's experience, and of
amazing
course,
experience,
you know, and she was a great civil liberties lawyer, civil rights lawyer, and a great lawyer for children. She became an expert in children's rights when she was a young woman, and then, of course, went through the you know, this whole sort of business of politics and formal politics and institutional politics, and made a great contribution, and she's making a great contribution.
I know, and it's very kind of chastening, isn't it, when people sort of come out of office, you're almost more able to see them as a human again. And that's always one of the great sadnesses. So
If only it had been more on display, perhaps.
Well, it's a conundrum, isn't it? It's a conundrum. So I wanted to ask you, Helena, first of all, you know, just to round up the evening, in that conversation which you're both like hosting and negotiating, but also listening, what came out of that conversation for you?
Well, I mean, one of the things, and it is the message at the end, which is that, you know, things at the moment can feel pretty hopeless, and there are times when I sort of think, oh my God. I look around the world, and especially when I'm working in the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights, and looking around the world. I mean, if you look at what's happening just now, I'm working on Belarus, where, you know, there's a sort of tyrant in operation, and they're locking up people, and locking up, then people have lawyers who act for them in protest, and then the lawyers get thrown in jail as well, and so there's that. Then there's Myanmar, where there's been a coup. Then there's the business of Hong Kong, which is, you know, being overtaken by the Chinese. Then there's the Uyghur in China, who are really being persecuted. And so, you know, around the world, these horror stories. And so sometimes I feel quite despondent. And then I spend time with wonderful organizations, wonderful people who are doing their own bit in different... And then I feel inspired, as she says. You know, you have to kind of take your hope and spirit from the people you work with. I've got a great team of young, wonderful lawyers who work on this stuff, as you do, Kerry. And it's that business of working with great people, and all of you are making the difference in different ways. We all can make the difference. But this is a hard time, and we're going to have to keep struggling to get out from under it.
Yeah, it was good that she said, look, you know, you can push me away and I'll bounce back. I'll come back. Paul, what about you? What was the thoughts in your head tonight?
The two things that has always struck me about Mrs. Clinton is an internal optimism and a belief that tomorrow is going to be better today, and a determination to do it, and a defiance against people who get in the way, that I'm not going to go away and I'm going to shout louder, and the ability for not ripples of hope, but ripples of action to come from that. So the momentum that can build when you've got a leader that stands for something on principle that you can get behind. And you know, she's obviously clearly on top and has fantastic analysis of what's happening in the world today. But as we go to a volatile and a complex and ambiguous, a really difficult future, we've got to face it with principles and humanness. Otherwise, we will not have hope, and we will not be able to take them forward. We need leaders like that, I think.
Yeah, principled action. Yeah. Kerry, so, I mean, obviously, you know, you're familiar with a lot of the things that she's talked about over the years, and she was clearly very inspired by your dad as well, which is always marvellous to hear. America's a very tough place at the moment, as is the UK. But did a conversation like that make you feel hopeful again? Does it regenerate for you?
The thing that I was thinking about as she was speaking, I love how directive Hillary is. You know, there's no fluff. There's go out and vote and organize and stop these guys and be in a meeting and stand up. You know, it's very, very concrete actions that she's talking to, encouraging us to do. So I think that's really helpful. On the other hand, I think in activism, we can allow our egos to get too engaged in the outcome. So I think we sometimes have to let go of the outcome, because otherwise you can just feel like it's too much. What can one person do against global warming or stopping slavery? Or there's millions and millions of people. How can I get all the women who need to get out of Afghanistan out? You know, maybe I'll fail, and then you just need to crawl under the covers. But to say it's worthwhile to be part, to make the effort and let go of your ego need for the outcome. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we're looking for excellence. We can't afford not to be great. And so we want to be concrete about what works and doesn't work. And to say, we're going to take these steps and we're going to learn from our mistakes and we're going to move forward and we're going to take concrete action. So I think there's a balance of both of those.
Keisha, you're nodding in response to that. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about watching it was the intergenerational exchange of hope. I mean, we haven't known each other very long, but I get hope from you. And also, you know, I learn from you. And I think that idea of an elder, because she is an elder, as it were, getting a renewed strength because she's working with young people who have got a kind of resilience. I think that's very exciting. But what did you feel about her talking tonight?
Yeah, I feel like I share some of the sentiments to what's already been said, in that I really appreciated how pragmatic her responses were to all of the questions. Yeah, it really made me think about the way that when you're younger, hope and justice and those kind of words are fed to you as abstract nouns. But when you then start to engage with them, you realise they're actually verbs, that you need to do something, that it's an activity and it doesn't end. So that's what I really appreciated in listening, and it was very inspiring just to hear about her sphere of influence. And for some people, it could be intimidating because we can't all call and sort out visas for women in Afghanistan. We've not got that kind of power, but it just makes you think, okay, well, what can I do? Who can I speak to? If someone can work at that level, then that's being managed and that doesn't have to weigh on me. We were all on a spectrum, and I just need to see where my entry point is and what I can do. Yeah, so that's what I was thinking about.
So we're coming to an end this evening. If you have got the time to come back, if you're not already coming back for the weekend, please do. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you can get a wristband for the day. It's pay what you want. There are plenty of free tickets as well for community organisations. And you'll hear so many different kinds of stories and so many different kinds of actions. And I think it will give all of us an even kind of broader sense of what's going on, what's still to be solved, but also what's going on. And that makes you feel less lonely and also more committed. So if you've got the time, there are still some places left, but obviously they're going very, very quickly, like hot biscuits.
Like hot cakes.
Absolutely. So it would be great if you could do that. I mean, there's lots of people to thank for tonight. I want to thank the BSL interpreters again, Rob and Sam. And the home technicians, and all the Ripple of Hope team, and everybody, of course, and you.
And you.
And good night.